I never thought I'd be standing in a crowded room of finance executives, champagne flute in hand, listening to my own husband laugh as his colleague called me just a stay-at-home wife. My name is Alexandra Mitchell, Alex to most people, and 6 years ago, I was managing a $60 million portfolio at Bradenton Financial. Tonight, I'm at my husband Richard's company party, wearing a dress that cost more than my first car, smiling politely as Derek Winters, my husband's oh-so-charming colleague, loudly proclaims to everyone within earshot that I don't earn real money. The worst part isn't even Derek's smug face or the pitying glances from the wives who still have careers. It's Richard standing there, nodding along, adding, "She's more of a domestic goddess these days," with a laugh that cuts right through me. I take another sip of champagne, grateful for the bitter taste that gives me something to focus on besides the burning in my cheeks. 7 years ago, I was the rising star that Richard pursued relentlessly. 5 years ago, I was the supportive wife who stepped back from her career temporarily so he could focus on his big promotion. 2 years ago, I was still believing him when he said, "It's just until I get established, then you can go back." And today, I'm apparently just the punchline to a joke about women who don't contribute. I excuse myself, walking toward the bathroom but taking a detour through the elegant lobby of this building instead. I've always loved this pre-war brownstone, with its marble floors and crown molding. Richard and I rent a 2-bedroom on the 3rd floor, paying a small fortune for the privilege. As I run my fingers along the polished banister, I notice a small sign by the elevator. Building Management Office, Samuel Harris, owner. Something clicks in my mind as I recall the rumors that old Mr. Harris is finally looking to sell after 40 years. I check my reflection in the mirrored wall, straightening my shoulders and wiping away the hint of smeared mascara. Behind my eyes, I can see something awakening that's been dormant for too long. Richard thinks I've been playing house all these years, but what he doesn't know is that while I've been managing our home, I've also been quietly watching the markets, studying trends, and making small investments with money I've saved from our household budget. I'm not just a stay-at-home wife, I'm a financial analyst temporarily working from home. And as I return to the party, nodding politely at Derek while he drones on about his latest acquisition, a plan begins forming in my mind. If Richard and his friends want to underestimate me, that's fine. They won't see me coming. I met Richard Morgan exactly 7 years and 3 months ago during a charity gala hosted by Bradenton Financial, where we were both analysts, though in different departments. He was tall, confident, with the kind of smile that made you feel like you were the only person in the room. I remember how his eyes lit up when I challenged his investment strategy for emerging markets. "Finally," he'd said, "someone who can keep up." Our courtship was a whirlwind of late-night conversations about market trends, weekend getaways to small coastal towns, and promises of a partnership that would conquer both Wall Street and our personal dreams. We were equals then, or so I thought. The first year of marriage was everything I'd hoped for. We bought a small apartment, renovated it together on weekends, and celebrated each other's successes at work with champagne and plans for the future. But things began to shift when I received my promotion to portfolio manager before he did. Richard said all the right things. "I'm so proud of you, Alex." But I started noticing the tight smile that didn't reach his eyes, the way he'd change. The subject when friends asked about my work, the subtle comments about how my longer hours were affecting us. When he finally got his big promotion to senior manager, he came home with an expensive bottle of wine and a proposition. "What if you took a step back from work? Just temporarily. I'll be traveling so much, and this way, when I'm home, we can actually spend quality time together. We can afford it now with my new salary." It made sense at the time. A pause, not an end to my career. I believed him when he said it would strengthen our marriage, that it was just a season, that he valued my expertise too much to see it go to waste. The first few months at home were disorienting. I went from 60-hour weeks managing millions to suddenly having endless hours to fill. I threw myself into creating the perfect home, then took online courses to stay current in finance, and began following investment trends even more closely than before. I started with a small separate account, using the household money I managed to save by finding deals and budgeting carefully. I watched it grow, making careful, strategic moves. The first time I really felt the shift in how Richard saw me was 6 months after I'd left my job. He was preparing a presentation for a client, and I offered some insights on a particular investment approach. "That's cute, Alex," he said, not even looking up from his laptop. "But these are serious clients with complex needs." I reminded him that I had managed similar portfolios, and his response still echoes in my head. "That was before. Things change quickly in this business." That night, lying next to him in bed, I realized he no longer saw me as the sharp analyst he'd fallen for. I had somehow become a different category of person in his mind. Still, I told myself it was just stress, just adjustment, just a phase. I continued studying the markets, tracking investments, and building my private portfolio, all while maintaining the facade of the contented homemaker. I became the perfect corporate wife, hosting dinner parties where I'd serve Richard's favorite dishes and laugh at his colleagues' jokes while silently calculating compound interest rates in my head. The discovery happened on a rainy Tuesday last spring, the kind of dreary afternoon that had me organizing closets just to keep busy. Richard had left a stack of papers on his home office desk with explicit instructions not to touch them, which naturally piqued my curiosity after he left for work. I wasn't snooping exactly, just straightening up, when a Bank of America statement slipped out, showing a withdrawal of $30,000 to an account I didn't recognize. My financial analyst instincts kicked in immediately, and I found myself sitting at his desk, meticulously going through each document. What I uncovered sent a chill through me. Richard had been making increasingly risky investments with our joint savings, the kind of speculative moves that experienced investors approach with extreme caution. There were margin calls, leveraged positions in volatile tech startups, and, most alarmingly, a home equity line of credit against our apartment that I had never signed off on, despite my name being forged on the documents. By the time I finished my impromptu audit, I discovered nearly $200,000 in hidden debt and questionable investments. When Richard came home that evening, I confronted him directly, spreadsheets in hand. "What were you thinking? These positions are incredibly risky, and this HELOC is possibly fraudulent since I never signed for it." The change in his expression was immediate, from surprise to anger to something more calculated. "Alex, honey," he said in that patronizing tone I'd grown to hate, "you wouldn't understand the complexities of what I'm doing here. The market has evolved since you were in it." He proceeded to explain basic investment concepts to me as if I were a child, despite the fact that my old performance reviews, which I still kept in a folder, showed I had consistently outperformed most of my colleagues, including him. "Richard," I interrupted, "I managed $60 million in assets. I think I understand a simple margin call." He waved his hand dismissively. "That was different. This is strategic debt. I'm leveraging our assets for greater returns. Trust me, I know what I'm doing." But the numbers told a different story, and we both knew it. That night, after he'd fallen asleep, I made two decisions. First, to start secretly monitoring all our finances, and second, to create a separate emergency fund that Richard couldn't access. I began skimming from our grocery budget, claiming certain repairs cost more than they did, and selling clothes and jewelry I no longer wore, all to build my safety net. Around the same time, our elderly landlord, Mr. Harris, slipped a notice under everyone's door announcing his intention to sell the building within the year. While other tenants worried about rent increases under new ownership, I saw opportunity. I began researching property values in our neighborhood, management companies, financing options for commercial real estate. The more I learned, the more a plan took shape in my mind. The final confirmation that Richard no longer respected my financial acumen came at a dinner with friends a month later. James and Sophia had asked for investment advice, and I started explaining a conservative strategy for their retirement savings. Midway through, Richard interrupted with, "Actually, what Alex is suggesting is a bit outdated. Let me tell you what's really working in today's market." He then proceeded to outline almost exactly what I had been saying, presenting it as his own insight. Across the table, I caught Sophia's gaze. The slight raise of her eyebrow told me she had noticed too. That night, I transferred another $1,000 to my secret account and began seriously researching how to buy an apartment building. My resurrection as a financial being began with a coffee meeting with my former mentor, Elaine Westbrook. I had hesitated to reach out, embarrassed by how completely I'd dropped out of the professional world, but desperation finally overcame pride. Elaine hadn't changed a bit. Still razor sharp at 58, with her trademark silver bob and penetrating gaze that could spot a flawed investment thesis from a mile away. "Alexandra Mitchell," she said, studying me over her espresso. I always wondered what happened to my star analyst. I gave her the glossy version first. Supportive wife, taking a break, considering options, but Elaine had never tolerated half-truths. "Cut the crap, Alex. You didn't contact me after 3 years to tell me about your herb garden. What's really going on?" The whole story came tumbling out. Richard's undermining, the hidden debt, my secret fund, and even my wild idea about somehow buying our apartment building. I expected judgment or pity. Instead, I got strategy. "Your instincts are still good," she said, sliding a napkin with figures scribbled on it across the table. "That building in your neighborhood would be an excellent investment, and you're not as out of the game as you think." With Elaine's guidance, I opened a brokerage account under my maiden name, Alexandra Turner. I started small, using the $12,000 I'd squirreled away to make careful investments in sectors I understood well. I spent hours each day, while Richard was at work studying market trends, reading financial reports, and making targeted moves that yielded steady returns. Within 3 months, I had grown my initial investment to $18,000. By 6 months, it was $27,000. I devoured online courses on property management and real estate investment when Richard worked late, which was increasingly often. I began to suspect he was struggling at work, but was too proud to admit it. The irony wasn't lost on me. As his career seemed to falter, mine was quietly rebuilding from the ashes. The third blow to my marriage came on our anniversary. I had dropped hints for weeks, even mentioning it directly the morning of. Yet Richard came home empty-handed at 9 p.m., genuinely surprised when I pointed out the significance of the date. "You should have reminded me properly, Alex. You know how busy I am right now." As if keeping track of our marriage was solely my responsibility. That night, checking my investment accounts after he fell asleep, I realized I'd made more money that day in dividend payments than Richard had spent on our last 3 dinner dates combined. Something was shifting inside me, a growing confidence paired with a dwindling attachment to the life I'd been living. The next day, I scheduled a discreet meeting with Mr. Harris, our building's owner. I expected to simply gather information, but our conversation took an unexpected turn. "I'm not really looking for the highest bidder," the 82-year-old told me as we walked through the building's basement. "These developers want to gut the place, add all kinds of nonsense amenities, and double the rent. I've known some tenants here for 30 years. His eyes lit up when I shared my vision of maintaining the building's character while making necessary updates. "You remind me of my late wife," he said. "She always said buildings have souls that need respecting." By the end of our talk, I had something far more valuable than information. I had an ally. Creating a business entity without your spouse discovering it requires meticulous planning, especially when that spouse works in finance. I established Turner Holdings LLC, using my maiden name and listing my business address at a private mailbox service. Each step required careful maneuvering, using public computers at the library for research, having documents sent to Elaine's office, conducting calls only when Richard was guaranteed to be away. My investment portfolio continued to flourish as I applied the same analytical skills that had once made me a rising star at Bradenton. I focused on stable dividend stocks and carefully researched real estate investment trusts, building a track record that would help me secure additional financing. I scheduled meetings with banks during times Richard thought I was at yoga or meeting friends for lunch. Most loan officers were skeptical at first. A housewife with no recent employment history seeking financing for a multi-million-dollar building purchase raised red flags. But numbers don't lie, and my growing portfolio spoke for itself. I found an unlikely ally in Meredith Chen, a vice president at First Community Bank, who recognized the solid investment strategy behind my proposal. "I've seen too many women's financial acumen dismissed," she told me after our third meeting. "Your business plan is more thorough than 90% of what crosses my desk." The fourth wound to my pride came during a dinner with Richard's parents. His mother asked about my plans now that we'd been married for several years. Before I could answer, Richard jumped in with, "Alex is just a housewife these days, Mom, but she makes a mean pot roast." The table laughed while something hardened inside me. Later that week, I met with a group of female investors Meredith had introduced me to. These women, ranging from real estate attorneys to retired executives, became my informal board of advisors, offering guidance and occasionally pooling resources for promising opportunities. Managing my growing financial activities while maintaining my domestic facade became increasingly challenging. I took calls in grocery store parking lots, used the library's scanning services for documents, and kept a second phone hidden in my gym bag. There were close calls, Richard coming home unexpectedly while I was on a conference call with my attorney, forcing me to hide in our walk-in closet pretending to organize shoes. A bank statement delivered to our home address by mistake that I intercepted moments before Richard collected the mail. As my confidence grew, Richard seemed to diminish. He began coming home later, drinking more, and snapping at minor inconveniences. I discovered he'd been passed over for a promotion he'd considered guaranteed. Instead of sharing this with me, he buried himself in increasingly desperate investment schemes. When I gently suggested he diversify his positions after overhearing a phone call about another margin call, he lashed out, "What would you know about today's market? You've been out of the game for years." Little did he know I was arranging meetings with Mr. Harris's attorney to structure a purchase agreement for the building. The owner had grown to trust me, appreciating my knowledge of the property and my commitment to preserving its character. I'd even begun quietly meeting with current tenants, introducing myself as a consultant for the owner to understand their concerns and needs. Mrs. Abernathy in 2B complained about the outdated kitchen appliances. The Rodriguez family in 4C needed the leaky windows addressed before another winter. The lawyer in 5A wanted better security in the parking area. I cataloged everything, building not just a purchase plan, but a management strategy. Each time I walked through the marble lobby, I saw not just my home, but my future, a tangible asset that would become the cornerstone of my newfound independence. The breaking point came at the Westmont Financial Group's annual gala, a lavish affair at the Pierre Hotel, where Richard's firm celebrated another record year, despite what I knew were serious struggles in his department. I'd spent hours preparing, choosing a classic black evening gown that cost more than most people's monthly rent, an investment in the image Richard wanted to project to his colleagues. The evening began pleasantly enough, with polite conversation and adequate champagne, as we circulated among Manhattan's financial elite. I played my part perfectly, asking just the right questions about children and vacation homes, never revealing that I could dissect a quarterly earnings report better than most people in the room. Then Derek Winters appeared, already 3 drinks in and loud enough to command attention from surrounding guests. "Richard, my man, and the lovely Mrs. Morgan, the stay-at-home wife. Tell me, Alexandra, what exactly do you do all day while the rest of us are making money?" Richard laughed, not the uncomfortable chuckle of someone enduring an inappropriate comment, but the genuine laugh of someone enjoying a good joke. Before I could respond, Derek continued, hand on Richard's shoulder like they shared a wonderful secret. "You're just a stay-at-home wife, right? One who doesn't earn real money? Must be nice having all that free time while the big boys work." The crowd around us tittered nervously, but Richard nodded along, adding, "She manages the household quite efficiently, though. Those skills are valuable too, in their way. In their way, as if managing a home was a cute hobby rather than work. As if the financial acumen I used daily to grow my secret portfolio wasn't real because it happened at a kitchen table instead of behind a mahogany desk. I smiled tightly, excusing myself to the ladies' room where I stood before the mirror, hands gripping the marble countertop until my knuckles turned white. Something crystallized in that moment. The realization that my marriage had become a gilded cage, and Richard had appointed himself both architect and warden. After composing myself, I returned to find Richard holding court among his colleagues. Later that night, Richard wanted to dissect the evening, complaining about office politics and a potential restructuring that threatened his position. When I suggested a hedging strategy his department might consider, he gave me that patronizing smile I'd grown to hate. "Honey, you wouldn't understand. The industry has changed completely since your day." My day. As if my financial career was some quaint historical period, like the Jurassic or the Bronze Age. As I lay awake beside his snoring form, I mentally calculated how close I was to securing financing for the building purchase. Just $200,000 short of what I needed. I decided I would liquidate my remaining personal investments if necessary. Sleep eluded me as I turned over every slight, every dismissal, every moment Richard had chosen to diminish rather than support me. The next morning, while Richard was in the shower, his phone chimed with a text message visible on the screen. "Can't wait to see you tonight. Same place?" From his assistant, Jessica. There had been signs. Late nights, unexplained charges at hotels, a new cologne I hadn't purchased. I had ignored them, focusing instead on my exit strategy. But now the proof glowed on his iPhone, confirmation that my marriage was as much of a sham as my housewife persona. The final nail in the coffin of our relationship came 3 days later, when Richard called, voice tight with panic, to warn me about a significant financial setback. He had invested heavily in a friend's startup without consulting me, using the majority of our remaining joint savings as collateral. The company had failed spectacularly, and we had lost nearly $80,000 overnight. "These things happen in business, Alex. You have to take big swings sometimes," he explained, as if losing a substantial portion of our safety net was equivalent to a bad day at golf. That night, while Richard worked late, or more likely wasn't working at all, I finalized the paperwork for my loan approval. I was done being underestimated, done being the punchline to jokes about women who don't earn real money. In 1 week, Richard would leave for a financial conference in London. In 8 days, I would own the very building we lived in. The morning Richard left for London felt like the first day of the rest of my life. I stood in our apartment doorway, accepting his distracted kiss, and reminding him to pick up the anniversary gift he'd ordered at Tiffany's. A gift I knew didn't exist, but the mention of which would send him into a panic and distract him from anything unusual happening at home. As his taxi pulled away, I allowed myself a moment of pure, unbridled anticipation before transforming our dining room into command central for Operation Building Purchase. The timing was tight, 5 days to execute everything before Richard returned. I began with a breakfast meeting with Mr. Harris and his attorney at a small cafe 3 neighborhoods away from our own. "Are you absolutely certain about this, Alexandra?" Mr. Harris asked, his weathered hands trembling slightly as he passed the final sales contract across the table. "Your husband doesn't know?" I explained that Richard would be brought into the loop eventually, but this initial transaction needed to happen without complications. The attorney looked concerned, but confirmed everything was legal. My separate assets acquired during marriage could be used for business purposes without spousal consent in our state. By noon, I was sitting in Meredith Chen's office at First Community Bank, signing loan documents and transferring funds from multiple accounts into the escrow established for the purchase. "Most people look terrified during closings," Meredith observed as I confidently initialed page after page. "You look like you're finally taking your first full breath." She wasn't wrong. Each signature felt like reclaiming a piece of my identity that had been slowly eroded over the years. The actual purchase was finalized the following day, a surprisingly understated affair for a multi-million-dollar transaction. I signed the final papers, received the keys to the management office, and just like that, became the owner of a 12-unit pre-war brownstone in one of Manhattan's most desirable neighborhoods. I celebrated alone that night with a glass of champagne on the rooftop garden. Now my rooftop garden, watching the sunset over the city skyline and feeling truly powerful for the first time in years. The next 3 days were a whirlwind of activity. I met with each tenant personally, introducing myself as the new owner while carefully avoiding mentioning that I also lived in Unit 3B. Most were surprised to see a youngish woman rather than another elderly man or corporate representative, but my knowledge of the building and its needs quickly earned their trust. I immediately authorized repairs that had been neglected for years. The Rodriguez family's windows were replaced within 48 hours, Mrs. Abernathy's ancient refrigerator was upgraded by the end of the week, and I hired a security company to install the system the lawyer in 5A had been requesting for months. Each improvement reinforced my position as not just an owner, but a capable manager of this significant asset. The practical challenges were numerous. I established a management company under my LLC, hired a part-time super who reported directly to me, and set up systems for rent collection and maintenance requests. I spent 1 full day in the building's basement, sorting through decades of records to understand its financial history. The previous owner had charged below-market rents, but had virtually no debt on the property, making my investment even more sound than initially projected. As I arranged for the first month's rent to be collected through my new management company, including from apartment 3B where Richard and I lived, I considered how to reveal the truth to my husband. A simple letter explaining the ownership change. might land before he returned, letting the paperwork speak for itself. Or perhaps I should wait until he complained about something in the apartment, then casually mention I could fix it easily since I owned the building. In the end, I decided on a more public approach, a small reception in the building's renovated lobby to introduce the new owner to all tenants, scheduled for the evening after Richard's return. The invitations went out by mail and under every door, including our own, bearing the elegant logo of Turner Holdings LLC and promising refreshments and an opportunity to meet your new landlord. The day before Richard's return, I received the first rent payments, including one from ourselves. The automatic bank draft for our apartment's substantial monthly rent, now flowing directly into my business account. Standing in the management office, surrounded by the tangible evidence of my secret financial resurrection, I felt a complex mix of emotions. Vindication, certainly, but also sadness for the partnership that could have been if Richard had seen me as a true equal rather than an accessory to his success. Tomorrow would change everything, for better or worse. I was finally ready to step out of the shadows. Richard returned from London jet-lagged and irritable, having apparently spent the entire flight dreading the non-existent anniversary gift conversation. I greeted him with practiced normalcy, asking about his trip while he complained about flight, delays, and British food. He didn't notice the new doorman who nodded respectfully at me, or the fresh paint in the hallway, or even the invitation to the owner's reception sitting on our entry table. It wasn't until the next morning that Richard spotted the notice about building repairs scheduled for the following week, complete with the Turner Holdings LLC letterhead. "Did you see this?" he asked, frowning at the paper. "Looks like old Harris. Finally sold to some corporation. Probably means rent increases." I murmured non-committally about the cyclical nature of real estate as he continued skimming the notice. "There's a reception tonight to meet the new owner. Want to go?" "Might be. Good to size up who we're dealing with now," I agreed casually, suggesting he wear the blue suit that complemented his eyes, privately amused at how completely he had underestimated me all these years. The lobby had been transformed for the evening event. Fresh flowers adorned the antique table, catering staff circulated with champagne and hors d'oeuvres, and a string trio played softly in the corner. I'd arranged everything meticulously, even hiring a professional photographer to capture what I knew would be a memorable evening. Richard and I arrived fashionably late, his hand possessively on my lower back as we entered the crowded space. I excused myself immediately, claiming I needed to use the restroom but actually slipping away to check final details with the building manager I'd hired, a capable woman named Lydia who had previously managed 3 other properties in Manhattan. At precisely 8 o'clock, Lydia clinked a glass for attention, and the room quieted expectantly. "Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming to meet the new owner of this historic property. I'm excited to introduce someone who has a vision for maintaining the character of this building while bringing it thoughtfully into the future. Please welcome your new landlord, Alexandra Turner Mitchell." The confusion on Richard's face as I stepped to the center of the room was everything I had imagined and more. His expression cycled rapidly from bewilderment to disbelief to something approaching horror as applause filled the lobby. I delivered a brief speech about community and preservation, about honoring the building's history while securing its future, making direct eye contact with Richard the entire time. "Some of you have already experienced the improvements we're implementing," I continued smoothly. "The Rodriguez family has new windows, Mrs. Abernathy has a new refrigerator, and the security system many of you requested is being installed next week." More applause, more approving nods, and Richard's face growing increasingly pale as understanding dawned. The questions afterward were predictable. Concerns about rent increases. Minimal, I assured them. Inquiries about the lobby renovation, starting next month, and requests for various improvements, all noted and many already scheduled. Through it all, Richard remained frozen in place, champagne flute clutched so tightly I feared it might shatter in his hand. When the formal portion concluded and people broke into casual conversation, he finally approached, a tight smile masking what I knew was simmering rage. "What exactly is happening here, Alex?" he hissed, maintaining a public facade of calm. "We should discuss this privately," I replied, but the damage to his pride had already occurred. Multiple neighbors had approached to congratulate me, several mentioning how surprised they were that even your husband didn't know. The revelation had become not just private, but embarrassingly public. Back in our apartment, my apartment, technically, Richard exploded. How dare you go behind my back? Where did you even get the money for something like this? Did you steal from our accounts? I laughed then, actually laughed at the irony. No, Richard, I didn't steal from our accounts. Unlike someone who invested $80,000 of our savings in a friend's failed startup without consulting me. I explained everything methodically, the secret investments, the separate business entity, the financing arranged through my growing network. With each detail, his face grew darker. You've been lying to me for years, he accused. Planning this betrayal. No, I corrected calmly. I've been investing wisely while you undermined and dismissed me. There's a difference. He cycled through reactions predictably. First anger. This is insane. You can't do this. Then bargaining. We should own this together, as a couple. Followed by attempts to take control. I'll buy out your share. Name your price. I stood firm through all of it, reminding him of every time he'd diminished. My financial acumen, every joke at my expense, every decision made without my input. The coup de grace came when I mentioned overhearing his colleagues at the gala. You're just a stay-at-home wife who doesn't earn real money, I quoted. Tell me, Richard, how does it feel knowing this stay-at-home wife now owns the roof over your head? The evening ended with Richard sleeping in the guest room, his worldview thoroughly shattered, while I reviewed property management reports in what had once been his home office. The weeks following my revelation unfolded like a psychological case study in male pride, confronting female achievement. Richard's reactions evolved in phases. First came rage, slamming doors, and threatening legal action, until my attorney calmly explained that everything had been done legally. Your wife used separate property acquired during marriage through her own investments to purchase the building. New York state law is quite clear on this matter. Then came manipulation, a campaign of guilt and nostalgia designed to regain control. Remember how we used to talk about investing together? This could have been our project, Alex. We could have done this as a team. When that failed, he attempted financial maneuvering, offering to formalize my ownership by creating a joint holding company that would, surprise, give him equal decision-making power despite contributing nothing to the acquisition. Finally, as each strategy failed, came a sullen acceptance punctuated by passive-aggressive comments about real estate being a bubble anyway. Meanwhile, I flourished in my new dual role. Managing the building provided a purpose and challenge I hadn't realized I'd been missing. I negotiated with contractors, approved renovation plans, and handled the 1,000 small decisions property ownership entails. My financial portfolio continued to grow as I leveraged the building's equity for additional investments. Friends and family reacted predictably along gender lines. Women generally expressed admiration tinged with vicarious satisfaction, while men often seemed uncomfortable, making jokes about sleeping with one eye open around their own wives. Richard's mother called to express concern about my undermining the natural order of our marriage, while my own parents, after initial shock, admitted they'd always wondered why I'd given up my career in the first place. The most satisfying aftermath came when Derek Winters discovered the ownership change. His law firm rented commercial space on the ground floor, and upon receiving notice of a modest rent increase, he stormed into the management office demanding to speak to whoever's in charge. Finding me seated behind the desk left him momentarily speechless. You? He finally sputtered. You own this building now? I smiled, enjoying the moment perhaps more than was strictly professional. Yes, Derek. Turns out stay-at-home wives can earn real money after all. Your rent increase notice explains all the terms, but I'm happy to clarify anything that's too complex for you to understand. He left without another word, and the story quickly circulated through Richard's professional circle, rehabilitating my reputation while simultaneously highlighting how thoroughly I'd been underestimated. As word spread in financial circles about my successful acquisition and management, I began receiving inquiries about potential opportunities and even job offers. Elaine invited me to speak at a women's investment symposium, where my story of financial independence resonated strongly. You're not just managing a building, she told me afterward. You're showing women another path. The personal toll was significant, despite the professional triumph. Richard and I existed in a painful limbo, neither fully together nor officially apart. We circled each other in our apartment, having the same arguments repeatedly. His sense of betrayal versus my years of dismissal, his embarrassment versus my suppression. The question of our marriage's future hung between us, complicated by practical considerations. Divorce would mean dividing assets, though the building remained solely mine. Reconciliation would require a fundamental restructuring of our relationship's power dynamic. Some nights, in rare moments of honesty, Richard would admit his behavior had been wrong. "I think I felt threatened by you," he confessed during one late-night conversation. "You were always better with the numbers, more intuitive, about market trends. It was easier to see you as just my wife than as competition." Other times, he would revert to defensiveness. "You could have talked to me instead of sneaking around. Marriage is supposed to be a partnership." The hardest truth to accept was that regardless of what happened with Richard, I had changed irrevocably. The woman who had subsumed her ambitions to support her husband's ego no longer existed. In her place stood someone who understood her worth and refused to apologize for her success. As the months passed, our social circle adjusted to the new reality, though not without casualties. Couples who had been friendly primarily with Richard often disappeared from our lives. Others seemed uncertain how to interact with us given our ambiguous status. But I also found unexpected allies, women who had similarly been underestimated and men secure enough in themselves to appreciate rather than feel threatened by my achievement. 1 year after purchasing the building, I hosted a small celebration in the newly renovated rooftop garden. String lights twinkled overhead as current and former tenants mingled, enjoying catered food and live jazz. The building had flourished. Under my management, occupancy remained at 100% with a waiting list. Property values had increased 16%, and the sense of community among residents had strengthened through regular events and improved common spaces. I stood at the edge of the rooftop, champagne in hand, watching Manhattan light up as evening fell. My real estate portfolio had expanded beyond this single building. I now owned minority stakes in 2 commercial properties and had established a reputation as a shrewd but fair investor. After months of painful conversations and couples therapy, Richard and I had reached our decision. The marriage that had begun with such promise 7 years earlier had fundamentally changed, as had we both. The final conversation happened without drama or recrimination, simply an acknowledgement that we wanted different futures. "I'm proud of what you've accomplished, Alex," Richard said as we signed the separation agreement. "I just wish I had been secure enough to support you from the beginning." The divorce was finalized 3 months ago, surprisingly amicable given the circumstances. Richard moved to Boston for a fresh start with a new firm, while I remained in our apartment. My apartment now, redesigned to reflect my tastes alone. The professional resurrection that began with a secret account had blossomed into a thriving investment company. Turner Holdings now employed 3 people besides myself, focusing on preserving historic properties while making them financially viable. I had resumed regular lunches with Elaine, who jokingly referred to me as her most successful protege-turned-competitor. The healing journey wasn't linear or simple. Some days I still felt the sting of those years of diminishment, the anger at opportunities lost while I played the role of supportive wife. Working with a therapist helped me process these feelings without letting them consume me. "The best revenge isn't owning the building," my therapist observed during one session. "It's being at peace with your own worth, regardless of what anyone else thinks of you." She was right, of course. The greatest victory wasn't in the property deed or investment returns, but in reclaiming my sense of self, my confidence in my abilities, my right to take up space in the world unapologetically. I'd also formed genuine friendships along the way. Maria Rodriguez from Apartment 4C had become a close confidant, her practical wisdom helping me navigate both building management and personal challenges. Meredith from the bank joined my regular tennis group, while several women from the investment symposium became both business associates and friends. Standing on the rooftop that evening, watching my community enjoy the space I had created, I felt a profound sense of completion. Not because the journey was over, far from it, but because I had survived the darkest parts and emerged stronger. I no longer needed external validation to know my worth. As the party wound down, a young woman who had recently moved into apartment 2A approached me. "I hope this isn't inappropriate," she said hesitantly, "but I heard your story from Mrs. Abernathy. I just left my job in publishing to start my own literary agency, and my boyfriend keeps calling it my cute little project. Your story gives me hope." I smiled, recognizing my former self in her uncertainty. "The people who underestimate you are doing you a favor," I told her. They're showing you exactly who not to believe. Later that night, alone in my apartment, I opened the small box I had kept from my banking days. Performance reviews, award certificates, the business card with my old title. For years, these items had been painful reminders of what I'd given up. Now they simply felt like artifacts from an earlier chapter, important but no longer defining. The most valuable lesson from this ordeal wasn't about real estate or investments or even independence. It was learning that other people's perceptions, even those closest to us, cannot determine our worth unless we allow them to. Being underestimated can be painful, but it can also be powerful if you use it as motivation rather than accepting it as truth. As I prepare to expand Turner Holdings into commercial development next month, I sometimes think about Richard and Derek laughing at that party, dismissing me as just a stay-at-home wife. Their laughter no longer hurts. Instead, it reminds me to look more closely at those others might overlook, to recognize the potential in people society tends to dismiss. After all, you never know when the person serving coffee, managing the household, or quietly taking notes in the corner might actually be plotting to buy the entire building. Have you ever been underestimated by someone close to you? How did you respond? Did you internalize their judgment or use it as fuel? I'd love to hear your stories of reclaiming your power in the comments below. Like this video if you've ever fantasized about proving wrong someone who dismissed you. And subscribe for more stories about women finding their strength in unexpected ways. Remember, your worth isn't determined by anyone's inability to see it. Thank you for listening to my journey, and I wish you the courage to pursue your own path to empowerment, whether that means buying a building or simply standing firm in your own value.